We've been following the United Methodist discipleship ministry. They kind of present you topics based on the readings. And I really like the topic about worshiping with rejoicing. And we started, it's been a long time, talked about the gathering, and then we talked about the call to worship, and then we talked about confession, and talked about how important preaching is in our worship. And last week we talked about benediction, and then I continued saying the church service does not end, the worship doesn't end at benediction. The formal part of the service has ended, but then we go forth to then continue the worship. And it's very interesting as we read that story in bits from how the temple was dedicated. I would like to encourage you, if you can, just when you get home, read that dedication of the temple, read that prayer. The words that were coming from Solomon about how important, the dwelling place of God, the temple, as they brought the Ark of Covenant. And we read that the glory of God came down to the temple, so much so that the priests and those who were serving were kind of suspended. Everybody was kicked out. It was like God saying, okay, I want to relax in my tabernacle. I want to enjoy my dwelling place. And the words of the prayer are very powerful. And when you look at the prayer of Solomon, you see that, God cannot be contained in a place. God's sphere and authority and influence is far beyond what human hands can make. So when we come to a place like this and we worship, and God visits us and inspires us and anoints us, we are supposed to then leave and go out there. So for Solomon, in spite of the fact that God has a dwelling place, he says the whole world is his tabernacle. He lives in the neighborhood, so to speak. And so it is important that as we live here, talking about benediction and receiving the blessing, it is important to ask the question again, worship continues when I leave that door. Worship continues as I go out there and live the life that Christ expects me to live. Actually, the whole of worship is just much more than a 1-hour worship service. And I know that, as Christians, we pay attention. We gather everything together, make the microphones work well, let the singing be done well, let everything be fancy, and that's great. But it doesn't end here. Real worship continues as we go into the neighborhood. I was speaking with someone, I think earlier this week, and I was talking about some of the things that our heritage has already presented us. We don't have a choice to be involved in our community. I always say that every time when I see many people in the community from our church doing one thing or the other, it's in our DNA as God's people, as Methodists, to say we have to be out there in the community because God is there. We see that in John, for example, John chapter 1 in verse 14, it says, and the word became flesh. I always like the Message version. And the word tabernacle, it moved into the neighborhood. God likes to come into the sphere, into the space of humanity. And our duty when we leave this place and we say the benediction, you are sent forth to go out. You remember in our tradition, the acolyte brings the light and takes the light out. That's why the light is on, the light of Christ, leading God's people out there to then go begin worship as we do ministry in different places. And we talk about how the glory of God came down. And when we begin to do those ministry out there and do those worship, God begins to tabernacle in the lives of people in little spaces that we create for him. I'm glad the college students are here today. As I said last week, as you get into the classroom, as you do your assignments in the labs, as you are on the sporting team, you bring Christ into that space. And people begin to experience Christ. Is an act of worship. So worship does not end here. It doesn't end at the door. It actually begins at the door. And I'm so glad that this week we continue to expand our influence as we begin our youth group, the various youth groups. And the Sunday school class is for children, and the one we have for adults. I know one of our members today who started coming to church to the Sunday school class, never showed up in this building, but just came to the Sunday school class. And the people embraced her and they showed God's love to her. And and she's a member today, not by coming directly into this building, but something else that we're doing outside there in the space. So sometimes we don't know how God draws people to himself. He uses different means, and sometimes they may never even come into this building. They may go to some other building somewhere, but we have shown them the love and the light of Christ. We had a wonderful time. Was it on Thursday? 4 men playing our ping pong. But it looks like a spiritual renewal for me, because before we started our play, we sat down and did a little devotional, and then we prayed, and then we played, and then we played again, and then when we were done, we prayed again. We prayed for our community. And it was so refreshing, and I said, this is what we mean when we say taking the presence of God to the various places that we go. So it's possible that when you go on to your golf course, it can become a place where you bring God's presence. Now you don't necessarily have to pray and read a devotional, but there is a way you live your life, even in the courts there, on the field there, that shows that this belongs to God, and you can minister grace to people. So what is my challenge to us today is that as the people of God, we don't force worship on anyone. We don't compel people. But we live our life and worship in such a way that there is a draw to us. There is an attraction, an invitation, a fresh expression of grace and glory in living such a worship-filled or worship-led life. Worship flows from us. And so when we're sent forth, continue to be a people of worship. Let me quickly address one thing that I've had people say many times. If I go into the rough world, if I go into the corrupt world, am I sure that I'm not going to be polluted by the things happening there, and my Christianity will be gone, and I will no longer be a good child of God? I've had people say that. So I like to keep my space and just stay alone. I don't want these people corrupting me. Maybe I'm too holy. I don't want them to bring sin into my life. But I think that God intends for us, like we said last week, to be light in the midst of darkness, to be salt in the midst of sourness. But I was reflecting on that, and I thought about the story of Jesus, the story of a woman who had the issue of blood. And the woman for 12 years had gone to different places, and nobody could cure her. And suddenly she said to herself, if I can touch the hem of his garment, I know I will be clean. Let me quickly say here, remember the Old Testament rule? If a man who is holy comes in contact with a woman who is bleeding, he becomes defiled. The man becomes defiled. The holy man becomes defiled. Part of when you read the story of the Samaritan, the man who is wounded, and the priest went the other side because he doesn't want anything dirty or blood or unholy to touch him. But we saw in the life of Jesus that instead of this woman defiling Jesus, what happened? Actually, the power from Jesus converted and healed her. So rather than being afraid of being defiled by this world, we are supposed to move into the neighborhood, into our spaces, various places that God is sending us. Not being afraid of anybody coming to bring death on us, but going with the assurance and courage and confidence that the life and the light and the Spirit of God in us can transform their lives. They will not draw us to themselves. We will draw them into the light, because light is always stronger than darkness. And I want to encourage you today. This season is time to be courageous. It's time to move into the neighborhood as we are being sent forth this year. Students, staff, administrators, parents, grandparents, everyone. Let's look for spaces where we reveal the love of Christ to all the people that we meet around us. Thanks be to God.